The animation begins with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the first humans from the United States, landed on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission in July 1969. At that time, they planted the American flag on the lunar surface, marking a monumental achievement for humanity. Now we see a group of kids competing in water skiing, including Mike, Marty, and Amy. They're all trying to grab each other's flags and then race to the finish line to stick them there. Sadly, Mike and his friends don't win, and they feel disappointed. Afterwards, Mike's mom comes to pick him up. It's his dad's birthday, and they're going to celebrate. Mike's father is named Scott, and he's an astronaut at NASA. Before heading to the birthday party, they stop by a retired astronaut's home to invite Mike's grandfather.
I'm fine.
But Mike's mom had already convinced Grandpa not to come because Scott and Grandpa don't get along. At that time, Mike is sad because he's never met his grandfather, but his mom promises to keep trying to bring their family back together. Later, they all went to a restaurant to celebrate. While there, they watched a TV show featuring a businessman named Carson. There, he told a story about his father's dream to go to the moon using his own rocket, but NASA wouldn't let him. Carson then claimed that the first moon landing was fake and showed video evidence that it was filmed in a studio.
I knew it. What?
Soon after, Carson announced his own plan to go to the moon and prove that the American flag wasn't really there. His words convinced many people, who complained to the president. The president feared that Carson might steal the flag and claim to be the first person on the moon. So, he ordered the police to interrogate Carson. The following day, Mike felt very sad because of his grandfather's behavior. It turned out Mike's grandfather used to be an astronaut at NASA, but one day he stopped talking to his family and left them all behind. Since that, Mike's father and grandfather never spoke again, despite his mother's attempts to reunite them. One day, Mike shared his story with his friends Marty and Amy. Then, Amy suggested that he should try to unite his father and grandfather. Soon after, Marty's father came to Mike's house to deliver some exciting news that they were going to the moon. It turned out that Scott had been elected commander, and they would be leaving on a rocket with the help of veteran astronauts. Then, Mike quickly rushed to meet his grandfather at the veteran's house, accompanied by Marty and Amy. At that time, Marty brought along his pet lizard named Igor, who had sophisticated tools on his body that could help them sneak in unnoticed. At that time, Igor checked the situation inside while Mike and Amy entered the house. However, Amy was caught by officers at the house and distracted them so that Mike could find his grandfather's room. Inside, he found many photos of his grandfather when he was an astronaut. Suddenly, his grandfather named Frank appeared behind him, and Mike gave him an envelope that contained a photo of little Mike with his grandfather. On the other hand, Carson was angry when he found out that NASA was planning to go to the moon. The real reason he wanted to go there was not to make history, but to collect a rare type of fuel called helium-3. He knew that helium-3 was abundant on the moon and he wanted to sell it on Earth to make a lot of money. He also had plans to make a dangerous weapon in the future. The next day, Mike, Marty, and Amy went to NASA and saw that the astronauts were welcoming veterans. At that time, Mike had a plan to get his grandfather to train his father for the mission to the moon. Then, they were interviewed by journalists and a spy reporter from Carson's team told him that Scott, Frank's son, would be the commander of the mission to the moon. Shortly after, Carson asked the reporter to sabotage the mission so that they would fail to go to the moon. Long story short, Scott started his training in flying rocket frames. Seeing that, Mike and his friends also wanted to try flying, but Frank wouldn't let them. However, Scott thought it was okay for the children to join in and asked them to fly, and they really enjoyed it. Suddenly, a journalist sabotaged the plane's fuel tank from afar. This caused the plane to run out of fuel and have to land immediately. Scott blamed Frank for not checking the plane carefully. Then, Frank asked to use the launcher immediately before the plane crashed. Fortunately, they managed to survive, but the plane caught fire. There, Scott hurt his leg badly and blamed Frank for everything, making their relationship worse. Meanwhile, Carson conducted a test on helium-3, which is 20 times more powerful than nuclear energy and dangerous as a weapon. However, he forced his scientist named Gags to try his weapon until he finally fired it. And it turned out it destroyed his lab, and Gags vanished too. Back to Scott. At that time, he felt like his family was cursed after the accident, which meant he could never fulfill his dream of going to the moon. When Mike heard this, he added that he would take his father's place and go to the moon instead. To prepare for the mission, Mike enlisted the help of Amy and Marty. Together, they observed the training methods of real astronauts and taught Mike the necessary skills, such as spinning and hovering. After Mike was ready, Marty helped come up with a plan to sneak him onto the rocket. One night, they set their plan into action. They water skied across the lake, but it turned out to be infested with crocodiles, and they had to avoid the officers who were patrolling the area. Despite the obstacles, Mike and Amy managed to jump over the gate. But poor Marty got stuck on the fence, which had been bitten by a crocodile. Soon after, Igor was following them without their knowledge, and the officers eventually caught Marty trapped in the fence.
There's your zombie shark gator.
Elsewhere, Carson was getting ready to take off on his rocket to the moon, but Mike and Amy snuck onto the rocket without anyone knowing. Unfortunately, Marty was caught by his dad and Frank, who then discovered that his grandson was on the rocket. Then, Frank rushed to stop them, but before he could, the rocket suddenly took off. It turned out that Carson had sabotaged the rocket so that it launched without the astronauts. At that moment, everyone was in a state of panic as they realized Frank and the children were trapped in the rocket, hurtling towards the moon. They had only 10 minutes to save them. Soon after, the police arrested Scott, the journalist who had helped Carson sabotage the rocket, but it was too late to stop the launch. Meanwhile, the president knew that Carson was behind the sabotage and ordered his arrest. On the other hand, Frank, Mike, and Amy put on their astronaut suits and prepared to leave the rocket. But then Igor, a little creature, jumped into Amy's helmet while Marty frantically searched for him. Sadly, at the same time, Carson had already taken off, using helium-3 energy to power his rocket. But then, Frank and his team chased after him in a NASA rocket, determined to stop him. Soon after, the president realized that Carson's plan was to steal the helium-3 energy from the moon, which could have devastating consequences for the world. Now, the fate of the world rested on Frank, his grandchildren, and their mission to stop Carson. Then, as they journeyed through space towards the moon, Mike's mother learned about the trip and immediately reached out to ensure her son's safety. She asked Frank to take care of them, and he agreed. Unfortunately, the trouble was brewing nearby. At that time, Carson caught wind of a NASA rocket crewed by others, and in a fit of jealousy, he sent a robot to destroy it. Seeing that, Frank knew he had to act fast and left the rocket to confront the rogue machine. Meanwhile, Mike saw his grandfather in danger and rushed to help. Together, they defeated the robot. But Frank was angry that Mike hadn't followed his instructions to stay on board. Later, as Mike and Amy slept, Frank contacted Mike's mother to express his gratitude for her help in reuniting him with Scott. He knew that Mike was also trying to mend the relationship between his father and grandfather. The next day, they landed on the moon, but their lunar module encountered a system failure. At the same time, Scott watched from afar as Frank asked Mike to help him regain control of the module, and Amy searched for the AGC button to prevent a crash. In the end, they managed to land safely and recorded the historic moment of their first steps on the moon. Finally, Mike and Amy were the first kids to set foot on the moon. The whole world watched in awe as they explored this mysterious, crater-filled landscape during a live broadcast. But something strange happened that the American flag they had planted had disappeared, replaced by Carson's own flag. Suddenly, people began to doubt the veracity of history.
Now what? Ha! I knew it.
From afar, Mike saw Carson's robot destroying all traces of the Apollo mission. One of the robots even damaged their signal antenna, cutting off communication with NASA. But all hope was not lost, as Marty knew how to communicate with Amy and he got to work on building the necessary tools. Meanwhile, Frank, Mike, and Amy were on the chase to get back their American flag from Carson. After a tough fight, they managed to grab hold of it.
What the heck?
What? That's my flag!
But as they made their escape, Frank fell and was taken by Carson. The team knew they had to act fast before it was too late. There, Marty was working tirelessly on building a new communication device with junk materials while the rest of the team were in pursuit of Carson. At the same time, Amy did her best to console Mike, who was feeling down because Frank had been arrested. But then, Carson appeared and made them an offer that if they handed over the flag they had acquired, they could have Frank back. With no other options, Mike went to meet with Carson. Meanwhile, Marty had just finished building a device. Soon after, Amy was startled by the flood of messages on her phone and realized that Marty had managed to intercept signals coming from Igor's organs. When they arrived at Carson's base, they were amazed by the amount of helium-3 energy that had been collected there. Then, they exchanged the flag for Frank, but Mike wasn't done with Carson yet. Soon after, Mike managed to get Carson to reveal his destination, which was the moon. Shortly after, the truth came out when Carson confessed that he had been collecting helium-3 on the moon. At that moment, the whole world was listening in and watching on live television, and they quickly labeled Carson as a criminal.
I always trusted NASA.
Finally, the truth was revealed, and the NASA scientists were amazed at the tool Marty had made to communicate. Shortly after, Mike managed to snatch the flag and escape through a burning pipe, but Frank had been separated from the group and fell, causing his helmet to break and his oxygen supply to run low. He was scared and trapped in the pipe, unable to move. Then, Frank explained that he had contracted chickenpox from Mike's father a few days before their mission to the moon. As a result, he was expelled from the mission and his dream was shattered. He felt guilty and distant from everyone. At the same time, Scott and others on Earth overheard their conversation through Igor's weapon. With the help of the weapon, Frank managed to get out of the pipe, but Carson was furious and confronted them. Then, Mike and Amy distracted Carson while Frank rushed back to the rocket to replace his damaged helmet before running out of oxygen. At that time, Mike and Amy was in a dangerous situation with Carson hot on their heels. Then, using their quick thinking, they managed to escape by surfing on debris. Soon after, Amy had a plan to gain an advantage over Carson by activating the rocket on Igor so he could go faster. Meanwhile, Frank made it to the rocket and swapped his helmet. But Carson's weapon misfired, hitting Gig's plane, which surprisingly turned out to be a robot. On the other hand, Mike hatched a plan to trap Carson in the helium-3 storage area by destroying the collected helium-3. Fortunately, it worked and it caused a massive explosion with Carson caught in the blast.
Follow my lead, Amy.
I'm gonna smash you!
When Frank saw the explosion, he feared the worst for Amy and Mike. But fortunately, they had managed to stay safe and everyone on Earth was ecstatic. At that moment, they even planted the historic American flag back in its place, which was broadcast live worldwide. Finally, they landed back on Earth and were welcomed by their families. Shortly after, Scott and Frank reconciled and embraced each other, while Mike brought his own family together. However, it was later revealed that Carson had survived and was floating in space with Giggs. It turns out that Giggs was a robot created by Gags. The animation ends. The moral of the animation is that even if you don't win the water skiing competition, you can still go to the moon and save the world if you have a pet lizard with sophisticated tools and a group of loyal friends who will help you sneak onto a rocket. And if your grandfather is a retired astronaut who doesn't talk to your dad, just give him a photo of yourself as a child, and he'll help you save the day. Always remember, if someone tries to steal the American flag from the moon, just destroy their helium-3 energy and everything will be okay.